Okay, so it's welcome everyone. It's 17th century literature that we're studying this semester, and this is in some ways one of my favorite courses, simply because I think it's the best literature. If you had to choose one era of literature written in English to spend your life's study upon, the 17th century would be it. It's a very rich period. It is still in the draft of the Renaissance, which began in Italy and then moved to England. And so we very much have the ideal of the Renaissance man in view, and the people that we are going to study would all fit under that description of Renaissance men, in the sense that they seem to be masters of everything, jacks of all trades, but they are masters of it as well, because the science of the day, the humanities, all of the fields of discovery could pretty much be understood by someone who has spent many years studying. You could have read pretty much all the books that were written and worthy of reading. Impossible now. And you wouldn't want to read everything that's written now anyway. By the way, they didn't read everything that's been written. They read everything that had been preserved and was considered worth passing on. That's what they read. So the great books were a common repository of knowledge that they all adhered to and could make reference to and expect that their audience would understand what they were talking about. That's not the case in the academy now. In the academy now, we have such hyper specialization that people in the same, what we would call subject, don't even understand what one another is talking about. They have their own conversations, they get funded to do research, and within that same field, people would not know anything of the subject matter that somebody within the same designation would be spending their lives talking about. So the lit theory people in English are not talking to people in other disciplines, or somebody who studies the 17th century isn't dealing with somebody who's studying the 20th century literature, and somebody who's studying English or British literature isn't talking to the American specialist, and so forth. And that will be in every discipline the same way. In psychology, it's even more problematic, because they're understanding what the psyche is varies so widely. So some think that the psyche is the brain, and so they're looking into biochemistry more or less. That's their area of study. Others are interested more in the moral dimension of psychology. And so that's their area of study, but what does that have to do with the brain per se? Well, there is some discussion of that, but the old school of psychology would have seen it more related to the spirit of the person as the psyche. The psyche people that see it as the spirit don't get along well with the brain people at all, because they just simply think what we're calling the psyche is a different thing. So then you get into the mind-body problem. How does a physical thing deal with a spiritual thing? Is there even a spiritual thing? Well, in the brain area of study, they actually dispute whether the spirit is anything. Can't be measured, can't be proven empirically through the empirical method. So is it really scientific at all, and is it worth studying? So there's a lot of interdisciplinary. It's the breakdown of the humanities in our day, and we're coming right into the midst of that while we're studying. 17th century was a similar period insofar as new ideas had been coming in, and they were starting to have their effect on the academy in general. So there was a new forms of knowledge. There was the discovery of the New World, reports of which are coming across the Atlantic. Remember, North America, South America had been discovered and colonized over the course of the 16th century. Remember, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yes, but the colonization takes place in the 16th century in the United States, up in Canada as well. And that is a process, and reports are coming back, but still not huge significant numbers. That changes the consciousness of Europe, however. What is this new world? Who are these people? Where do they come from? How does this fit with the biblical account of human history? Who are these people? Is this the lost tribe of Israel? All sorts of theories that are percolating. How do we relate to these people? Are they even people? Christians are pretty clear right from the beginning they are, in which case they are to be treated as human beings, and you're to evangelize them then. Share the gospel, treat them with the respect and dignity that comes with being a human being, all of that. So, but still, it's a new thing. The new world is a new thing. Likewise, Galileo with his telescope discovers that the constellation of the planets, the whole cosmology of his day, which was wedded to an Aristotelian cosmology in which things outside of planet Earth were eternal, unchanging, perfect, had a fatal flaw. Namely, it didn't account for what he could see with his telescope. There was a nova. A nova is literally something new. Something new in the heavens. It was moving across the sky and it didn't fit in with this view. Likewise, he could see that there were moons circling not around the Earth, but rather around Jupiter. It breaks the cosmology. It doesn't account for the phenomena as they can see it with the telescope, which is intensification of the vision of the human eye. No one would have been able to see this in the past. So the telescope starts to introduce new ideas. In the Reformation, we get a challenge to the church's authority from within the Christian sphere. How do we deal with those people? And so there's a breaking up of the settled consensus of what is often called the medieval synthesis. The medieval synthesis, which is the fusion of classical learning with Christian thought. Now, I'm going to talk about that in the first lecture at some length. I'll talk about the Elizabethan world picture, or we could talk about it as the discarded image if you want to use C.S. Lewis's designation. But that will form the sort of a foundational discussion of the poets of the period, which is what we're here to do, is to study the literary figures of the period. But they have certain things in common. And one of the things they have in common is that their world is becoming more and more complex. We often think of great transitions from one era to the next in terms of revolutions. They often use that phrase, revolution. But a revolution is usually at least the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution is a violent, rapid overthrow, repudiation, denigration of everything that came before. Everything before is wrong. It's false. What's come is true. What was in the past is false. And so we think of this huge paradigm shift, like it's a sudden overthrow of the way things were. That's not the 17th century. In the 17th century, new ideas are being introduced that it's not clear how they fit with the way things were thought in the past. And what they do, however, is they hold on to the old knowledge as well as accepting that there's better ways of looking at it. But they're not willing to get rid of the whole picture. They're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So even in that sense, the phrase scientific revolution is false. There is no revolution per se. There's a new methodology for studying science. The empirical method, the scientific method of which you will have learned in schools, of studying things, replicating the results and so forth, making certain of what you can observe. But it's not really repudiating root and branch everything that came before. It's trying to understand it better. And so the period of even the literary figures, we will note, they're aware of the challenge of the new ideas, and it's distressing to them. But at the same time, especially if they're Christian, they are brought to a greater understanding that truthfully we live by faith and not by sight per se. So if the old way of looking at things was too certain and is probably wrong, that doesn't mean that we need to discard it altogether, because there's something that of the lived human experience that needs to be preserved in the midst of all that. So it's a period of transition, and it's a transition, and now it sounds like the air of inevitability, towards the Enlightenment period. But the Enlightenment period, which follows the 17th century, is dominated by an anti-Christian spirit. The French Enlightenment philosophes are intensely anti-clerical and anti-traditional. And by the time we come to Immanuel Kant at the end of that period, late 18th century, they are revolutionary. And he literally proposes the Copernican turn as a way of looking at philosophy, and that's revolutionary. It's effectively throwing aside the old ways of looking at things entirely. Dare to know, think for yourself, don't trust authorities at all. That is not the 17th century. The 17th century adds to the authorities, doesn't throw any away. We need to listen to the past. We need to consider new ideas at the same time, and we're going to hold those in tension. So it's a very rich, complicated, paradoxical period, and it gives rise to one of the main schools of literature of the period, the metaphysical poets, who are marked by nothing other than this sort of tension, this sense of irony and paradox in all things. So the way we're going to approach it, because I'm calling it 17th century literature, I only have like 12 weeks or so. An impossible thing to do, cover so much ground and so many good writers in such a long, diverse period in one semester. We're going to look at it by looking at the outstanding writers of the age. We're not going to go to minor characters. When I say they're minor, they're really good, even the minor characters. The minor writers are in any other age would be considered to be great writers. And I just don't have time to get to them. And it's not because I don't think they're worth studying, it's just I have only a certain amount. So I'm going to go to the major writers acknowledged by the Academy in general, and I agree with the assessment, and see them as representative of basic trends. So we'll begin by looking at Donne and Bacon in particular. Francis Bacon, I'll just look at a few of his essays. And then we'll spend a few weeks looking at John Donne, and then we'll go to George Herbert, and we'll come to the classicist Ben Jonson, and so forth. But these are at the beginning the metaphysical poets. They're called the metaphysical poets. So we'll try and look at them as in a chunk. And Ben Jonson, I will spend a little bit of time simply because he deserves the treatment. Normally he gets put aside. He's a classicist. He doesn't like the metaphysical poetry. He thinks there's something disturbing about the metaphysical uncertainty. He believes in the stability of, and that there's a good and a true and a beautiful and a just way of portraying things, and it's represented in his poetics, which is very economical in the way it expresses things. It's very quite beautiful, but it's very much at odds with the spirit of the age, which is sensing the conflict and wanting to express it in its literature. This is the age, by the way, the late years of Shakespeare. I just did the Shakespeare class last semester. The great tragedies are written at the beginning of the 17th century. And it's the age when Milton is coming. So the two great writers in the English language are both writing in this same period. So it's the end of the Elizabethan era. We're moving into Jacobean and Carolingian writing, Charles I and so forth, reckon it in accordance with the kings. I will then move on to Robert Herrick, another sort of classicist, and then I'll come back to the metaphysical poets with Marvell, Vaughan, and Traherne. You'll note that I skipped Milton out of this, and that is not because I don't love Milton, but because I dedicate a whole course to Milton. It's slightly perverse of me not to put Milton in the 17th century. But as I say, it's because I do a whole semester on Milton, and everyone has to take it. So I haven't dropped Milton, I've lifted him up in that sense. But he belongs in this period. And I will mention Milton along the way. So we're going to study the major writers of the age, and we need to understand the paradox that they see in the world living around them. So again, if we're thinking this is England, we have, after Henry VIII, we have an official Anglican church. That is now the established church in England. The Catholic monasteries, the priories and so forth are seized by Henry, and the money taken from them is put in his coffers, and you can see the carcasses of these grand abbeys all littered all around England to this day. Beautiful, but also rather devastating when you think about it, that there was once this Christian civilization rooted in these grand abbeys and so forth, which effectively got seized by the monarch of the day in the name of true religion. And Christendom, as it was practiced, is effectively, he doesn't make it illegal, but he effectively takes away all of the property and the financial viability of it. Catholicism is permitted in England, but it's effectively prohibited. You can't be a Catholic and go to Cambridge or Oxford University. So it's not just that the king becomes Anglican, so do the universities. So does the system of patronage in the British government. So Anglicanism becomes a new form of Catholicism within Britain very quickly. And there's tensions there. And those tensions are played out in this period as well. Because amongst the Protestants, and the Anglicans are not the only Protestants, we have Presbyterians, primarily up in Scotland. We have Baptists. So the London Baptist Convention puts out a statement in 1689, so later on in this period. But the Baptists are moving Congregationalist type churches. They're emerging in the 17th century. And then there's even more radical Protestant sects out there in this period that are part of the English Civil War, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. Who believe that all forms of authority are effectively demonic. So it's not enough to get rid of the Catholics. They're opposed to the king on principle. They don't think that God ordained a man to rule over others in the way the king claimed he had authority as God's chosen regent. So there's all sorts of, you can see the fragmentation, the political aspect of this, and it becomes seditious to suggest that the king is not. In other words, you can be imprisoned or tortured or killed for questioning the monarch. So there's a tradition of the established church in England, the Anglican church, and then there's the dissenters. And the dissenters include all of the other Protestant denominations. The Catholics don't even get mentioned. They're clearly, those are the Antichrist. The Pope is the Antichrist. In the Anglican prayer book, the Pope is called the Antichrist. The other Protestant denominations are not the Antichrist, but they're dissenters, and they are not the relationship between the Anglican expression of the Christian faith and the other Protestants is pretty uneasy. And there's sanctions and difficulties with being a nonconformist on this. That's another way of putting it. You're a nonconformist. You don't conform to the Anglican rules. So this is the 17th century. So it's very rich and complicated. And that I talked about the problem of cosmology and science. I'll say more about this in the next lecture. And I talked about the discovery of the New World. And I talked about the incursion of modern science because of Galileo, and René Descartes meditates on that right in the middle of this period, the 1640s, with the beginning of most people see as the beginning of modern philosophy, the Cartesian cogito. But we also have the political conflict, which is right in the center of this period and really is the central political event in English consciousness, and probably to this very day. When the monarch of the day, Charles I, so if you recall a little back history here, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, has no child, so when she dies, the question is who's going to succeed her, because there's no legitimate heir. She doesn't have offspring. She can't pass it on to her son. And James I of England, the 6th of Scotland, becomes the heir. Well, but James is from Presbyterian land, up in the north. Well, and now he's the King of England. This is problematic, and will create all sorts of tensions there, as you can imagine. I'll leave aside the discussions of James's personal life and so forth, which is problematic for many, because we have a movement within Anglicanism and within the Baptists and within the Presbyterians called Puritanism, which you might have heard about as well. And these are still in the spirit of the Reformation, of trying to reform the church and make it more holy, more the bride of Christ described in Scripture, holy and blameless, without spot or blemish. That's the dominant motif within all Protestant circles. There is resistance within Protestant circles there. There's high church Anglicanism, Archbishop Laud and so forth, that is more Catholic in his inclinations in any rate, but the Puritan spirit is there in the midst of all that, and there's real tension there because Laud leans towards Rome and Charles I leans towards Rome, and that creates real religious tension within Protestant circles. And that problem is exacerbated because Charles I is not a very good king and is a bit of a tyrant. In fact, he's accused of being a tyrant by his Protestant subjects. And that plays out when Charles asks for money from Parliament. We have Parliament, we have the parliamentary tradition now, which we take for granted. But Parliament and the rights given to Parliament are really one of the consequences of Magna Carta back in 1215. So 4 centuries in the past. We have the king who rules, and then we have Parliament, the nobility of the land, who rule alongside of him, as a check and balance, as it were. It's always an uneasy relationship. But in this period, it becomes the potential for conflict escalates because the Protestant nobility, and they are largely Protestant, if not wholly, refuse to grant Charles money for his wars. They won't give him the money he wants. He thinks he's entitled to it and they should do it. So in response to the refusal to give him money, so Parliament, just like in our day, has to pass a budget. They refuse to do that. He disbands Parliament, prorogues it for years. And this means that he is ruling without any collaborators in the aristocracy. And they are starting to get angry with one another, both sides. And the animosity grows and eventually breaks out into the English Civil War. So on the one hand, you have the royalists led by Charles, and he has his own private army. They don't have a standing army, by the way. Professional soldiers do not exist unless you're paid by somebody who's wealthy enough to pay as his own private army. And the king has that private army. So think of King Lear, where he has a retinue of 200 men. That's not a lot of people, but it would be in the day. Now we have thousands, hundreds of thousands in times of world wars. This is a retinue of a few hundred men whose sole occupation is to be at the king's beck and call and do whatever he wants. They're his bodyguard, but they're also his intimidation force. And the only one who can muster a counterforce are the nobility, and they do the same. So now we have 2 armies, the parliamentarians, or the Roundheads, because they're Puritans, they're called the Roundheads, derogatory term. And then we have the Cavaliers, or the King's Army. So the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads, the Cavaliers being the King's Army, or the Royalists versus the Parliamentarians. And they end up skirmishing, having little conflicts here, there. Multiple times Charles gets captured in conflict. They make him agree to back down and to collaborate with the parliamentarians in running the country. He agrees to it, and then when they release him, he goes back on his word. After going through this for several years, they say, enough of this. This man is a tyrant. He is incorrigible. He's unrepentant. We can't work with him. He is clearly not only upsetting us, he's defying God's legitimate reign and rule in the Kingdom of England, so off with his head. At that point, we have a Republican government come into place with Oliver Cromwell as the head, who had been the head of the army at the time. He then becomes the ruler over this. In the same way you could see George Washington does in the United States. Same idea. The chief general becomes the first president in the US. Here he becomes the ruler of the republic. When he dies, the republic basically collapses. And Charles II comes back from France, Charles's son, and restores something like what his father had before, and a new conflict begins. But that period, that fight, is the central political event in the whole English period, and it's the backdrop for Milton's career. I talk about that in the Milton class, but also for many of the poets we're looking at here. So for Donne, it's a little after Donne. Herbert, it's a little bit after Herbert even, because he dies. But it'll be there for Herrick, and it's certainly there for Marvell and Vaughan and Traherne. The reason I say that is Andrew Marvell had to intercede on Milton's behalf to prevent him from being executed. Because Andrew Marvell worked for, where is it? I didn't even mention it here. Not sure that I did. Lord Fairfax. Lord Fairfax was his patron. Lord Fairfax was one of the significant aristocrats of the day, the most able military man. And he led the parliamentary forces alongside Cromwell against the king, but he refused to participate in his execution. He wouldn't do it. He said, I won't go that far because of the implications of executing a king. I'm not going to do that. I'm willing to push him to the point, but I'm not willing to go along with that. So he retires to his estate, Fairfax. And Marvell, who writes with him, has influence when Charles II comes back. He says, okay, so who am I going to work with here? I'll work with Fairfax, because he didn't execute my father. So he knows restraint, there's a limit there. And because of that, when Marvell intercedes on Milton's behalf, because he's connected with Fairfax, he says, okay, we'll let the old man who's blind, we'll leave him alone for the rest of his years. And then he writes Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes. But that's part of the complexity of this whole period. So lots of conflict. It would be a very difficult time to live. It's a rich period for literature, having said that. So that's what we're going to do here. It is a literature class. I'm going to give you, in the next lecture, a discussion of the Elizabethan world picture. But this is the syllabus. You know where we're meeting here. Oh, I mentioned Milton, and then I dropped him. I've got to take that out. I think I cut him out after the fact. I've recommended the Broadview Anthology. You don't need to use that. You can use any 17th century collection you wish. We will primarily look at poetry. Even though there's a lot written in the period that deserves our study and attention, there are essays in the period by Bacon. Begins the essay form in English. We could even look at Bacon's Novum Organum. We could look at Shaftesbury's Characteristics of Men, Studies in Character, very much part of the Puritan spirit of the age. We could even look, and I'm not going there, we could look at Pilgrim's Progress, written by a famous Puritan as well. I'm going to avoid all that for the sake of looking at shorter, more digestible literary products like poets, which are seen as the great literary form anyway. So we'll look at Donne, Herbert, as I say, these two being metaphysical poets. Then we'll move to the tribe of Ben, the classicists, for 3 weeks. Include Amelia Lanier in that, because in this March 13th, we're going to look at the so-called Great House poem. The poem representing the aristocrat and his estate representing a little Garden of Eden on earth, and expressing the cultural mandate as it was understood in the day. Integration of the Christian faith with practical life, just like in Downton Abbey. Right? It's a remnant of that. You have the Lord of the estate, and his task is to manage the estate. It's not to make money. It's to make sure that there is virtue and peace reigning in that little plot of land that he owns, so that everybody is there for the edification of everyone else. The servants serve the master looks after the servants. There's a sort of a harmony that takes place within the estate. And all this is a representative of a return. We have an Adamic figure operating under Christian understandings, looking after his little plot of land. And that will be representative of political views as well. So we'll look at that. In the midst of all that, I think Amelia Lanier's is particularly good. Then we'll go back to Herrick in the midst of all that, and we'll see something more of Johnson's classicism before we return to the metaphysical poets Marvell, Vaughan, and Traherne. Increasingly pietistic in their formulations, I'd say. Anyway, and then at the end of this, evaluations. 2 essays and a final exam. How about that? Surprise, surprise. First essay right after reading week, second a month later. And then the exam, I'll let you know more when I know more. The registrar sets the time of the exam. Do you have any questions about the syllabus at any rate, as it stands? All that sort of stuff I don't need to repeat. No, didn't think so. So I'll just leave it at that.